The 1960s weren't just about muscle cars and classic style. Some of the weirdest rides ever hit the road too. From outlandish designs to bizarre features, these three cars pushed the limits of automotive imagination. Get ready to discover the weirdest cars of the 60s. You won't believe they actually existed. The AMC Rambler Tarpon, 1964, is one of the great what-if cars of American automotive history, an experimental concept that had the potential to predate the pony car revolution, only to be shelved before it could make its mark. Had it been put into production, it might have beaten the Ford Mustang to the market and reshaped the segment before it even had a name. Instead, the Tarpon remains a fascinating relic of what could have been. A sleek, sporty coupe designed by a company better known for station wagons and economy sedans. A fish out of water, the origins of the Tarpon. To understand why the Tarpon was such an unusual move for American Motors Corporation, AMC, you have to look at the company's history. AMC was built on the idea of practicality, efficiency, and value, traits that had served it well throughout the 1950s and early 1960s. While Ford, Chevrolet, and Chrysler were focused on full-size cars and performance models, AMC positioned itself as the underdog, offering smaller, more affordable alternatives like the Rambler series. The company's reputation was built on sensible, no-nonsense vehicles for families and commuters. Then came the Tarpon, an unexpected departure from AMC's usual philosophy. The idea behind it was simple: build a compact, stylish coupe that would appeal to younger buyers looking for something more exciting than a traditional Rambler. Inspired by the success of fastback European coupes, AMC designers sketched out a sleek, aerodynamic shape with a roofline that swooped dramatically from the windshield to the rear bumper. The result was unlike anything AMC had produced before. A car that looked fast even while standing still. Its name, Tarpon, came from a species of fish known for its speed and agility in the water, qualities AMC hoped to embody in the car's design and driving experience. The sleek, narrow body and sporty proportions made it seem almost futuristic, especially compared to the boxy sedans that dominated AMC's lineup at the time. Could the Tarpon have been the first pony car? When the Tarpon was unveiled as a concept car at various auto shows in 1964, it generated considerable interest. The market was shifting, and young buyers were beginning to demand smaller, sportier cars that weren't just downsized versions of their parents' sedans. This was the very same trend that would soon lead to the birth of the pony car segment, a category that didn't yet exist when the Tarpon was introduced. Had AMC gone forward with production, the Tarpon would have hit the market before the Ford Mustang, potentially changing the entire trajectory of American performance cars. It had all the elements of a pony car: compact size, sporty fastback, styling, and a focus on style over pure utility. But there was one problem. The Tarpon was built on the Rambler American platform, which was significantly smaller than the mid-size platforms that Ford and Chevrolet were developing for their future performance models. This presented a dilemma for AMC. If they had moved forward with the Tarpon as it was, it would have been too small to compete with what was about to become the Mustang, Camaro, and Firebird segment. If they enlarged it to fit a bigger V8 engine, it would no longer be the lightweight, nimble fastback that made it unique. Why AMC passed on the Tarpon? AMC executives were hesitant to gamble on a small, sporty coupe at a time when the company was still focused on practical family vehicles. There was concern that the Tarpon wouldn't sell well because it lacked a proper V8 option. At the time, it was intended to be offered only with inline-six engines. Instead of taking a risk on an untested segment, AMC decided to shift gears and rework the Tarpon into something larger. The result was the AMC Marlin, a fastback coupe based on the larger classic platform. While the Marlin carried over some of the Tarpon's styling cues, it lost the sleek proportions and lightweight design that made the original concept exciting. It was too big to be a pony car, but too small to be a true full-size coupe, leaving it stuck in an awkward middle ground. The Marlin failed to capture the enthusiasm that the Mustang and Camaro would generate, and it faded into obscurity after a few years. Meanwhile, Ford released the Mustang in April 1964, kicking off a performance revolution and setting the blueprint for what a pony car should be. By the time AMC finally entered the pony car race in 1968 with the Javelin, they were already years behind the competition. The Tarpon's legacy, a missed opportunity. Looking back, it's easy to see how the Tarpon could have changed history. Had AMC taken a bolder approach and committed to production, they might have beaten Ford to the punch and become the originators of the pony car movement. Instead, their hesitation cost them valuable momentum, and they were left playing catch-up for the rest of the decade. The first time I laid eyes on the Peel Trident, I honestly thought it was a joke. It looked like something straight out of a 1960s sci-fi movie, a cross between a moon buggy and an amusement park ride. The body was absurdly tiny, almost comical in its proportions, and then there was that transparent bubble canopy, a feature that made it look more like a spaceship escape pod than a car. I had seen photos before, of course, but seeing one in person was something else entirely. It was almost hard to believe that this thing was ever road legal. I remember walking around it, trying to wrap my head around just how small it actually was. It barely came up to my waist, and the whole thing was so light that I could probably lift one side off the ground if I really tried. When I reached for the door handle, I realized there weren't any. Instead, the entire bubble canopy lifted up, like some kind of fighter jet cockpit. Getting in was a bit of a challenge, even for someone of average size like me. I had to duck my head, squeeze my legs in first, and carefully settle into the small, molded seat before pulling the canopy back down. Once inside, I had my first real moment of doubt. Could I actually drive this thing? The cabin was ridiculously cramped, shoulder to shoulder. I'd have a hard time fitting anyone next to me unless they were practically a child. The steering wheel was barely bigger than something you'd find on a toy car, and the dashboard was stripped down to the absolute essentials: a speedometer, a fuel gauge, and a couple of switches. That was it. No radio, no air vents, no luxury of any kind. Just pure, unfiltered minimalism. Starting the Trident up was another experience entirely. The 49cc engine roared, or, well, coughed, to life with the unmistakable sound of a small, overworked scooter. At idle, it rattled so much that I could feel every vibration through the seat. Pressing the accelerator, I quickly learned that speed was not the Trident's strong suit. It took what felt like ages to reach 30 miles per hour. And even then, the tiny engine sounded like it was begging for mercy. Driving on an open road was equal parts hilarious and terrifying. Other cars absolutely dwarfed me. Sitting in traffic next to a regular sedan made me feel like I was riding a child's Power Wheels toy in the middle of a real-life highway. At one point, a truck pulled up next to me, and I could see the driver doing a double take, then laughing as he pointed the car out to his passenger. That was a common reaction. People either laughed, pointed, or pulled out their phones to take a picture. The Trident was an instant conversation starter. Parking was about the only thing this car truly excelled at. I could fit into spaces that weren't even meant for vehicles: sidewalk corners, narrow alleyways, even through some doorways if I really wanted to. I once rolled it inside a friend's garage between two motorcycles, just to prove that I could. The car was so small and light that, if I ever got stuck, I could probably just get out and push it where I needed to go. But as fun as it was, the Peel Trident had its drawbacks. For one, the bubble canopy made it feel like I was sitting inside a greenhouse on hot days. There was no real ventilation, no way to crack a window. When the sun was shining, the heat trapped inside was unbearable. In the rain, things weren't much better. The curved shape of the canopy meant water streaked in all the wrong places, and I had to wipe the fog off the inside of the windshield with my hand while driving. And then, of course, there was the issue of safety, or rather, the complete lack of it. The Trident had no seatbelts, no crumple zones, and if I ever got into an accident, I had no doubt that I'd be the one to come out worse. It was a car that demanded caution at all times. Still, despite all of its impracticalities, the Peel Trident had a certain charm that was impossible to ignore. It was ridiculous, impractical, and utterly bizarre. But it was also fun in a way that no modern car could ever be. Every drive was an adventure, every stoplight a spectacle, and every parking lot a mini car show. It may not have been fast or powerful or even particularly useful, but in the end, that didn't really matter. The Trident wasn't about transportation. It was about pure, unfiltered joy. The first time I ever laid eyes on a Chrysler Turbine car, I felt like I had stepped into a science fiction movie. It didn't just look futuristic. It was futuristic, even by today's standards. It had this sleek, low-slung body, painted in an exclusive bronze hue called turbine bronze, which shimmered under the sunlight like polished copper. The front grille was elegant and understated, but the rear end, that's where the magic was. The taillights were sculpted to resemble jet afterburners, a subtle hint at the power plant lurking under the hood. It was the perfect representation of early 1960s optimism, a car built for the space age, promising a future where we'd all be cruising around in turbine-powered machines, effortlessly gliding down the highway on an endless stream of kerosene, or even, if the stories were true, tequila. Yes, tequila. You see, the Chrysler Turbine Car wasn't just special because of its radical engine design. It was special because of what it could burn. Unlike traditional internal combustion engines, which needed gasoline or diesel, the turbine could run on almost any combustible liquid. Gasoline, of course. Diesel, no problem. Kerosene, jet fuel, peanut oil, Chanel No. 5 perfume. You name it, the turbine could probably burn it. Chrysler engineers even demonstrated it running on tequila, just to prove a point. Imagine rolling up to a gas station in 1963 and asking for a fill-up of whatever was cheapest. Heck, you could have poured in cooking oil and kept driving. That kind of flexibility was unheard of. But the most surreal thing about this car wasn't just the fuel, it was the sound. When you turned the key, you weren't greeted with the familiar rumble of a V8 or the hum of an inline-six. Instead, the turbine spooled up with a high-pitched whine, slowly building into a smooth, ghostly whoosh, like a distant jet engine warming up for takeoff. It didn't idle like a normal car either. There was no rhythmic thumping or pulsing exhaust note. Instead, it had this steady, almost ethereal sound, a constant turbine-driven hum that made it feel more like a spaceship than a car. People would stop and stare, unsure if they were witnessing some kind of experimental aircraft driving down Main Street. And driving it, that was a completely different experience. Unlike a traditional piston engine, which builds power through combustion cycles and gear shifts, the turbine delivered power smoothly. There were no cylinders firing, no mechanical jolts, just a seamless, uninterrupted surge of acceleration. It didn't matter whether you were at a stoplight or cruising at 60 miles per hour. When you pressed the accelerator, it responded instantly and effortlessly. No downshifting, no lag, just smooth, turbine-driven power. It wasn't blazingly fast, but it didn't need to be. The experience of driving one wasn't about quarter-mile times or 0 to 60 runs. It was about the feeling, the sensation of gliding through the world in a car that felt like it had been transported from the future. Chrysler knew they had something special, but instead of mass-producing the turbine car, they took a different approach. They built just 55 of them and handed them out to everyday drivers as part of a real-world test program. The idea was simple: see how people actually lived with a turbine-powered car, gather feedback, and refine the technology. For a select group of lucky drivers, this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to be part of history, to drive a machine unlike anything else on the road. Some fell in love with it, praising its futuristic smoothness and jet-like charm. Others found it odd and impractical, complaining about the heat from the exhaust, the fuel economy, and the unfamiliar driving dynamics. But none of that really mattered in the end, because the turbine car was never going to make it to production. The government, oil companies, and even Chrysler's own accountants saw to that. The turbine was too expensive to mass produce, and while it had far fewer moving parts than a traditional piston engine, meaning fewer things to break, it also wasn't particularly fuel efficient. At a time when emissions regulations were tightening and the auto industry was being pushed towards smaller, more economical cars, a jet-powered sedan just didn't fit the mold. Chrysler quietly ended the program, recalling almost all of the turbine cars and destroying them in a scrap heap, One of the most heartbreaking endings to what could have been one of the most revolutionary automotive experiments of all time. Today, only 9 Chrysler Turbine cars still exist. Most are in museums, preserved as relics of a future that never was. A few are in private collections, and an even smaller handful are still in running condition. If you ever get the chance to see one in person, don't just look at it, listen to it. That turbine whine isn't just the sound of an engine, it's the sound of innovation, of unfulfilled dreams,